Good afternoon. My name is Robert Curry, and today I want to explain the purpose of a simulation that I recently participated in, the importance on the topic of conflict. In an effort to demonstrate my understanding of conflict and its fundamental character, its root causes, its execution, and its results, I participated in a simulation exercise. I acted as Hussein Iskhanov Advisor to Aslan Maskhadov, president of the Chechen Underground Movement. And actually more than just a movement, it was a government. The focus of this simulation, I feel, is two-track diplomacy, which is not negotiating a specific outcome, but rather opening up communication between conflicted groups, developing approaches to differences in identity, desired outcomes, discussing the sources of violence and discontent, and encouraging understanding of the other party's concerns. Ideally, sustained two-track diplomacy promotes reconciliation and builds public support and political will for long-term developments that contribute to a lasting peace. The simulation's importance to the Chechen crisis analysis is that it has allowed the class to apply concepts and theories covered in the course, such as causes of conflict, conflict resolution and mediation, actors in conflict resolution, perceptual issues, and most importantly, intervention, because that's what we want to see is intervention to reduce conflict. A discussion of what I knew going in would kind of really be focused on the Russian and Chechen wars. I knew most about that just because of my experience in the military and reading case studies in the past. The conflict between Russians and Chechens in Chechnya has taken a variety of forms. What began as an independence movement in 1991 and was by 1999 transformed into a fractured movement with significant conflict between Chechens fighting for independence, Chechens fighting for an Islamic state, criminal elements. This added religious component, coupled with the increased use of terrorist tactics, has resulted in a complicated, protracted conflict that has had mixed reactions from outside parties. Some excellent reading on the topic that I looked through over the past couple weeks was by Theodore Gerber and Sarah Mendelsohn. Casualty sensitivity in a post-Soviet context, like Russian views of the Second Chechen War. What was really important there is a lot of times what you read is the Chechens' perspective or the West's perspective on Chechnya. But it's very important to understand how Russia views the conflict, especially the national identity and the anti-criminal aspect that they view the conflict as. Emma Gilligan wrote a great one about the cost of peace in Chechnya, talking about how as peace increased in Chechnya, so did actually the prevalence of crime because of a weak government construct. So as Russians pulled out, more crime took place. So the peace actually caused more problems for the country in the short term. Gail Lapidus wrote Contested Sovereignty, the Tragedy of Chechnya. That was really focused on just the sovereignty issues between Chechnya wanting to be independent, Russia wanting to maintain its sphere of influence, and then the human casualties associated with it. And Camille Yilmaz wrote The Rise of Radical Islam in Post-Soviet States, Fiction or Reality, and kind of tried to clear the air on what was real, what wasn't, and why Islam was used as a tool to spur Muslim participation in the independence movement, because obviously those different groups, the group that wanted just independence from Russia, and then the group that wanted to set up its Islamic state, and how they interacted both positively and negatively. The Russian Federation invasion into Chechnya was officially an effort. To pursue terrorists and criminals hiding in the mountainous rural areas and prevent violent secession. It was perceived to be that some of the war that intended to rectify the embarrassment of the Russian loss years earlier. The aftermath of the First War resulting in Russian loss laid groundwork for a Russian invasion. The promised Russian aid and the commitments to combat terrorism and crime by the Chechen president, my president in the simulation, Aslan Maskhadov, were never really fulfilled. Persistent crime, especially kidnappings of diplomats, foreigners, and former Russian army conscripts, led to a massing of Russian troops under the auspices of protecting Russian citizens. And that's something that's very important. Putin always is framing everything about protecting Russian speakers, protecting the Russian people. So any independence movements, Islamic or non-Islamic, really would go against his persona that he's built up about revitalizing the Russian strength. During this time, Boris Yeltsin's approval rating had tanked due to the failure to manage the economy, organized crime, and terrorism. Putin gained public support for the strength that he showed and experience of Russian intelligence. The Russian people had an electric promise that the Chechen conflict would be forcefully ended, and the invasion enjoyed the political support of almost the entire electorate in Russia. And obviously popular dissent was stifled. The political parties involved include the Russian Federation, the Chechen Republic, which was the self-proclaimed independent state, and then obviously you started to develop over time a more Islamic focus, which would have been our third party, and then obviously the West looking from afar. The withdrawal of Chechnya from Russian Federation was an assault on Russian sovereignty and border integrity. The First Chechen War started with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so right away they wanted to be free. This conflict led to brutal fighting and exodus of Russian workers until a ceasefire in the mid-90s. At this point, Russian soldiers withdrew from Chechnya. When that happened, separatist groups grew, the economy was slow to recover, and resulted in more crime and desperation. The tension of the separatist group and pro-Chechen terrorist attacks led to another Russian invasion, which was really a way for Putin to solidify his power base. The resurgence in Russia to maintain its sphere of influence through demonstrative forces also brought European members back into a more active role in NATO. That's where the West really started wondering about their security. However, it is important to view what is happening on the world stage during this conflict. The United States and Russia relations were improving at that time because of September 11th attacks. So anything that was anti-Islam, I shouldn't say anti-Islam, that's not the right term, anti-Islamic extremism was viewed by the United States as enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So looking at it that way, they really let Russia do what they want without a lot of outside view, as long as there wasn't too many civilian casualties. The focus of Western governments was not to prevent Russian influence, but to ensure that instability forces, especially ones that would involve and promote the infiltration of these terrorist encampments, were allowed to take place. They wanted Russia to go in there and clean house. Every conflict can generate an argument as to the cause. While the conflict in Chechnya had many catalytic conflicts such as ethnic tension, financial pressures, external actors like the West, I propose the key topics were really mostly about Chechen sovereignty, excuse me, that sovereignty was really the key thing. Is they wanted freedom from the Russian sphere of influence, and Russia wanted to maintain it. Interestingly, the Chechen War is the only violent succession movement with all former Soviet socialist republics. The Russian government considered the conflict to be a separatist war, which, unlike a war on foreign soil, is a conflict which is more willingness for casualties by the public. This made defeat in the war not just a mean political shift, but also a loss in perceived territory. Anything that involved Chechnya leaving in any way was a loss to Russia, and they feared that that would become a catalyst for other republics to succeed. In the process of constructing a counterfactual simulation of the conflict, it is important to focus on the main factors that would have been produced a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Based on documented patterns, associations, and deductions, the most likely scenario will present itself. The simulated responses will demonstrate a great value for the Russian Chechen decision makers and their respective societies. I think it shows that an alternative response could be relevant in resolving similar circumstance of war that could realistically happen sooner versus later as other countries seek independence or more nationalistic outcomes across the world, as we see a little shift politically to the right and a resurgence of nationalism versus globalism. What has happened to progress the conflict at this point is Putin has aligned his abilities to the outcome of the war, so he must win in order for his strength base to continue. Russia risked that its territory would become another Afghanistan. Worse more, the authorization for other Soviet republics to remove itself from Russia's sphere of influence. So again, they could not let Chechnya go. Then from there, you had assassinations of viewed leaders of Chechnya. Chechens were willing to submit reluctantly to a Russian-backed leader as long as it was a Chechen leader. Russia tried to unsuccessfully preserve this as kind of a satellite state in this way, but Islamic fundamentalist opposition, also the independent interested folks that were backed very softly by Western powers encouraged Russia not to allow itself to show weakness. The Chechen people were impressive in their ability to be strong-willed in the resistance of Russian incursion. However, due to underrepresented government, no leader, no majority support, no external actors that were supportive of the present leadership, they did not have the ability to transform into an effective independent movement. The transition of control in Chechnya to Aslan Maskhadov, my president, in the simulation, after the First Chechen War, changed the international perspective of the whole struggle. Because of his Islamist ties he used to solidify his power base, it made this become more of a criminal aspect. The rise in crime and violence reduced the view of political legitimacy and really prolonged the conflict. My lessons learned from the simulation: the efforts that must be avoided are increasing the force that alienates moderate Chechens, allowing the systemic fighting that persists, negotiating a Russian withdrawal that would only weaken Russian influence and result in a free movement of Islamic extremists that would be able to destabilize other Russian proxies further. Russia's relations with the West must also find a mutually beneficial outcome. Both parties have suffered the effects of Islamic extremists, and which is part of the United States' inclination to look away from Russian hardline tactics. However, moving forward, both Russia and the West have interests in the Caucasus, to which Chechnya is the center. The conflict has no favorable options in respect to Russia's desired outcomes in the current construct. They don't want to lose territory. As discussed in the forums, Russia's superpower mentality hindered the peaceful solution to the problem. There's also complexities of involving third parties in the negotiation process. Russia must be willing to either cede some control, which will result in a setback of Russian interest, or apply overwhelming force that diminishes Russian prestige, could cost a lot of resource and a loss of life. When you develop a counterfactual simulation, you try to assume the event or state you're simulating is already real. The mind and subsequent deliverable items that fill the steps needed between a prolonged Chechen instability and Russian control and credibility. The difficulty of this is the bias that, from a Western perspective, continued uncertainty will weaken Russian abilities within the region and provide an advantage for NATO partner regions. So, what's that really mean? I only got a few minutes left. How do I recommend things be done differently? Negotiations can be successful only if the opponents conceive a preferred outcome that did not require the elimination of either side. Russia and Chechens need to realize there cannot be a one-sided resolution. Each side's goals would be at least partially met regardless of electoral victory or defeat. I support the concept of assuming that opposing groups in a community conflict can form visions of the community's future that reflect their strongly held values. Those values can be identified, measured, and perhaps even be brought together to produce a common vision that best incorporates the divergent values. The method can be used to map the values of different groups in Chechnya are about future development of their country. This process can clarify the value preferences and positions and locate potential areas for moderation and cooperation. I think the same process then can be used in other conflicts. So, understanding the other, looking at those perspectives, looking at the simulation forum folks of the journalists, the politicians, the average citizen, and their perspectives, and getting everyone together to where they can understand that there can't be a clear winner and loser and a compromise has to be in place, and then focus it on developing the economy, involving multinational organizations, involving multiple governments, so that way everybody feels a legitimate stake in the outcome. So the forum was interesting. I did learn a lot. It was interesting to do the role playing that actually almost made it a little difficult for me. Not super creative. Not to mention I've also been traveling a lot for work. I'm actually living in a hotel room for the last few months. So I had to actually come into work so I could have a little bit more of a professional environment versus the headboard of my hotel room. So I appreciate you listening. I hope this provided value for everyone involved, and I look forward to finishing up the course. Thank you.